Record. Recording in progress. So welcome. Glad we didn't scare everybody away the first class. So welcome back to shading and lighting. Today we're going to start our lighting. So today is very simple geometry and simple single light source. This way you guys get a chance to learn the basics or the principles of light. So principles of light are, we're going to go over this many times, but these I have actually taken from digital photography. Where's that book at? So I can get the right name. Where are you? Principles of light. Here we go. Light, Science, and Magic, an introduction to photographic lighting. All right, so principles of light. Light direction, light intensity, light color, and in photography, they consider light contrast and light hardness to be separate. For us in CG, I've lumped those under shadow quality. What is the quality of the shadow? Is it hard or is it soft? If it's hard or soft will depend on your light type and the position of the light in relationship to your subject. So if you do these in order, you are pretty much guaranteed to be successful in what you're trying to do. A lot of times, people, when they first start off lighting, don't know what to do. They don't understand. But if you always go by the light direction first, you can't go wrong. And remember, shadow is always 180 degrees away from the light source. So you take care of your direction, take care of how bright the light is, then if there's any color in the light. Now, a lot of us, just kind of assume, oh, white light all around us. And for the most part, you would probably be correct, except that there is a little bit of warmth in some of our artificial lights and even our natural lights. There's also a little bit of a cool property certain times of the day. So that's what we're going to be exploring today. And just with a single light source to kind of make it simple. And we'll come back to these principles in a little bit. So for today, download project2_SAL_Arnold. That will contain all three of your source folders. You'll get a Maya project folder, you'll get a Photoshop template folder, and you will also get reference. All right, so office hours tomorrow, I'll be around from at least 10 to 4 on Discord, by message, by email. Tomorrow, Frank will most likely be running the Zoom Open Lab for campus and online. Remember, this is optional. Just another way to get help. And it's really good if you've got a complicated problem where it's going to take a lot of screen sharing. Like I said, we can take care of that a little bit in Discord. It's not bad. It's not as robust. It's hard to host more than 1 or 2 people at a time to share. But, whatever works, we'll take it. All right, so classroom etiquette, just a reminder, please maintain at least 3 feet of social distancing in the room at all times. Make sure you wear your mask all the time. In fact, if you notice, all of the doors at Full Sail say, make sure you wear a mask in any building all the time, especially in class. We want to keep each other safe and healthy, and that's our responsibility. Wipe your station down. We don't have any wipes, but we do have alcohol spray. So I highly recommend you give your station a quick spritz before you put your stuff out. When you're done, pack up, give it another spray just to kind of let the alcohol sit there for at least 30 seconds. That should kill quite a few nasty germs. If you're sick, please do not come to campus. You need to be home. That way, even if you are not sick with COVID, you don't want to get worse coming to class and or possibly infecting somebody else. Remember, no headphones or earbuds during lecture unless you are listening to lecture. And if you're doing that, let me know ahead of time. Also, phones on silent. I just checked mine because I'm always notorious for forgetting to turn it on silent mode. Okay, so some questions. Everybody have a working version of Maya 2022? Everybody good? Okay, how about out there in the Zoomosphere? Everybody good? All right, Katie's good, Jerry's good, Brian's good. Maddie, Deja, Haley, all right, awesome. All right, Nelson, Nate just got it, he's good, okay. Make sure everybody have the Arnold, Maya to Arnold M2A plugin working, and hopefully you got the latest version. Like I said at the beginning of class, you need at least 4.1.1, but the current version now is 4.2.3. All right, any feedback on the rendering doc? Anybody see any errors in it or anything that you think might need to be added inside of it? If you do, send me a message, send me an email, because we're always looking to correct any errors or add in anything that, you might need to, you might think needs to be included. We can take a look at it. All right. What did you guys find out to be a good starting point for a production quality render? All right, so we got camera AA, samples. Remember, those are the global samples. Everything gets multiplied by them. We've also got diffuse. And for today, these are going to be the only two we're going to worry about again. So put a number in the chat, call it out. So camera AA. Let's start there. 4, okay, 4. Anybody else? 6. Anybody else? 4, okay. Honestly, I would say between 4 and 6 are probably really good. I always start with 4, just as a starting point. If I feel like the whole scene is kind of lacking, then I'll crank it up maybe a little, maybe 5, maybe 6. How about diffuse samples? You said 8? 7 or 8, okay. Okay, Deja's 8, Maddie's 8. Yeah, honestly, my kind of go-to for diffuse samples, only because I'm so used to all the other renderers always having a lot of noise in the indirect or bounce light areas, that I always keep that at a high quality, because that is always going to be the noisiest. So I usually start off with 4 for camera AA, and I'll usually go to 8 for diffuse. Now, if I find the scene still is a little noisy, the diffuse samples, I might bump that up, but generally not. What I'll try to do is bump up the camera AA, because that usually means some of the other areas are going to need extra sampling too. So I might go 5 for camera AA, or even 6. 6 and 8 for me would be considered like pretty high quality. If you just turn them both on 8 and 8, then you're going to get close to an hour, maybe 2 to render, depending on the size of your scene. So, I mean, that is a big commitment. And quite frankly, something that big, you're not going to need on the size of the renders we're doing. Right now, we're doing half HD. HD, you know, first gen HD is usually 2K, which is 1920 by 1080 high. So it's, you know, it's going to be kind of a trade-off. Once you start going full 2K, 4K, 8K, then you're going to need a lot of sampling. And quite frankly, hopefully you're not doing them on your laptop, because that's going to take a little more horsepower. I mean, it can be done, but it's going to take a lot of time. All right, good. Any information need to be clarified? Anything not clear about rendering, about the templates or anything? But you got any questions, campus here or in Zoom? All right, looks pretty silent there. Yesterday, I was testing out Maya 2020 and decided just for fun, I'd go to Autodesk's website. And if you go into Autodesk, log in, go to your account, the main area's got like kind of a welcome area, and it'll tell you any kind of notices that are going on. And for the first time, and this is brand new to Autodesk, they actually listed, hey, there are updates for Maya 2022. So for me, that was a good deal, only because we at Full Sail generally don't like to switch versions of Maya until at least the first update. Because whoever uses it, they're the guinea pigs. They find all the errors, Autodesk fixes them, and then everybody else jumps on board. So there is an update for 2022.1 for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So if anybody has 2022, I recommend getting this. I started testing it yesterday. So far, so good. I'm still a little leery about doing it live for now. I may change my mind on Friday, but it looks real promising. For Mac users, it is a brand new full version, so you have to uninstall the Mac version, which means you take it out of your applications, put it in the trash, and then install. The license is still there because it doesn't sit inside the Maya folder. It's still in there, so it will automatically recognize everything that you do, hopefully. And if you've updated Arnold, the new version of Arnold works perfect with 2022.1. Like I said, don't switch to 2022 yet for our class. Stay on 2020. But it was pretty encouraging. So of course they're saying deliver new features and important fixes. So blah, 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 blah. If you're using Windows, Windows will update the current version that you have on your computer. It is an update for Windows, but for Linux and the Mac, it's a full install. Apple and Linux have always done it that way. I have a feeling because the installer is not what they call recursive enough, which means it doesn't go into subfolders and subfolders and subfolders accurately. Why Windows can do it, I don't know, but it's kind of been that way for a long time. I have a feeling because Unix-based operating systems, which is Linux and the Mac, are a little more leery about recursive programs going down too deep in the OS. They're very security aware. And that just may be the architecture, and it's just not going to let it in. But just a kind of public service announcement there for you. All right, so I got a chance to grade a few assignments today. Make sure that you read the requirements in FSO. Make sure for delivery, for naming, uppercase, lowercase is important. A lowercase a and an uppercase a are considered two different words in most operating systems and most scripting applications. So when we script things, we are basically trying to make things automated and make them easier. If you have a file name with SAL all in lowercase, that's going to be completely different from a file name with all caps or an initial cap in lowercase. They're all different. And scripting languages are usually very precise. That's why naming is so important in a production, because everything is, as much as possible, automated. You want to move things along. You want files to be able to go to the right location. You want to be able to take it from that location, take it back, or go forward in the pipeline. Be able to get a status on any file at any time in that production pipeline, which is always a big deal for management. So all of those things are really important, and that's usually name-based. All righty, so links for reading. Don't forget, all the O'Reilly books are inside each activity. In fact, let me go here. So we have some new reading for you. So we do have the Light, Science, and Magic, Introduction to Photographic Lighting, the Principles of Light, why they're important, what is light, what is color, and also the Jeremy Byrne book, which is Digital Lighting and Rendering. Really good stuff, talks about shadows, and this is all CG based. So it's all about shadows, occlusion, shadow algorithms, how shadows, depending on the rendering package, shadow detection can be vastly different. Make sure you check your email often, along with your messages. Just a reminder, if you need to attach any files to give me, make sure you send them in an FSO document. Don't take the chance that Full Sail will quarantine it, because if it's timely or it's important, I may not get it immediately. Just a reminder, we are technical. Please take notes. Take notes. If you need to, rewatch the videos, ask questions in lecture, ask questions in lab. Lab is a great place to get help on all of these assignments and to get all the information reinforced. So attendance at Full Sail is encouraged, it's expected. It's not quite mandatory yet, live attendance, but trying to get everybody ready, because as far as I know, they're still trying to push for September to be all live in-class learning. We'll see how that pans out. Hoping we get this Delta variant of COVID-19 under control, so that doesn't change any of our plans. All right, delivery checklist. Make sure you complete the activity in FSO. Once the assignment uploads, I always recommend go back to the main window, the dashboard, then go back into the assignment, make sure that your file's uploaded, because FSO once in a while could be network, could be, power glitch somewhere along the way, may make it look like it goes through, but it actually doesn't. All you need is an interruption anywhere for things not quite to work out. Like I said, naming, watch naming for files, for folders. Watermark opacity should be 15% for all assignments, whether it's listed in the docs or not. Make sure you have the correct reference in the template. Make sure it's a Targa format. So far, everybody that turned in stuff, I only had 1 or 2 Photoshops in there. The rest were all good. They were Targas, awesome. I'm also a stickler for making sure your renders are snapped into position. So in Photoshop, if you have to zoom in and make sure the edges are snapped of the image in the template. And if you have to, just go up in Photoshop, turn the guides off, just so you can see. And it works. Worst comes to worst, just save it out. Take a look at it in a Mac preview program, because then you don't have guides or anything like that. You can take a look at it and see how it looks. All right. Any questions before we get started? Anybody? Everybody good? Okay, how about out there in the Zoomosphere? Questions? Haley's good. Katie's good, thank you. Nelson, Jerry, Joshua, Maddie, good, thank you. Brian's good. Deja's good, thank you. All right. So let's talk a little bit about light. And for this, we're going to kind of take a trip back to basic high school science. High school science, high school physics. We're going to talk about what we see, why we see, how we see. All right, so we have this whole bandwidth of information. Bandwidth is just a category of energy that we are aware of called the electromagnetic spectrum. And at different frequencies, meaning how these energy waves vibrate, if they vibrate and they're really big and they're giant, they are on the lower end of the spectrum, like the audio spectrum. We've got radio on the left there. And the smaller and smaller those waves get, the more compact the energy is. And as they get smaller and smaller, they don't become audible, they don't become visible, they go out of our sensory range. But fortunately, we've got instruments that can detect them. They get smaller and smaller and smaller, and they change the type of information that they can hold and that we can get from it. So we've got radio. Radio gets a little bit smaller. We got microwaves, still not visible to the human eye. From there, we go into infrared. Infrared, we can detect temperature with it. We've got devices that can see infrared, but it's still not completely visible to the human eye without extra equipment. We get into this visible light spectrum once the energy compresses a little bit more. It compresses. We get into that visible light spectrum, and we have basically light or that energy broken down so our eyes can see it into different wavelengths. So we've got the old Roy G. Biv rainbow scenario there: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Right? That's basically when all of those together are equal, we get white light. But from that white light, we can break it apart using a prism to basically deflect the light, different frequencies. Now, once we go beyond visible light, we get into ultraviolet light, UV light. This stuff we have to guard our eyes from with the sun and our skin. And it really is got a lot of energy, even though we can't see it. And from there, we get into X-rays. X-rays can basically go through soft tissue, but they can't go through the harder calcified parts of our body, which is usually the skeleton. So, and that's how we can detect. We got breaks, we got strains, we can see if there's any issues going on underneath all the meat suit we walk around in. From there, we get into gamma rays. You turn into the Hulk if you have too much of it, apparently. And there probably is more beyond gamma, but we just don't know it's there or haven't made devices to detect it. So just because we can't see it doesn't mean something else out there doesn't exist. There's always that theoretical possibility. So, but the miracle for us is this tiny little bit of energy, which is the visible light spectrum that we're interested in. Now, for the visible light spectrum to work, our eyes or our optical sensors need to be able to detect that information and break it down so that the incoming information stimulates our retinas. The retinas then send biochemical energy to the brain. The brain tries to unscramble what the retinas have been stimulated by. Basically, what visual input do we see? Now, inside our retinas, we've got basically two main receptors in there. We've got rods and we've got cones. Now, rods are basically sensitive to the intensity of light. They basically help us with a bunch of things. One is when there are very low levels of light, our eyes have trouble distinguishing color. Go outside at night. It's really hard to see color when there's very, very low levels of light. Everything kind of looks grayish, black and whitish. You might be able to make out some faint colors if you go close enough to them. But generally from a distance, I mean, take a look at the skyline, you see trees, but you really can't see if they're green or not. They just look like silhouettes. That's because there's really not enough light there to stimulate our cones. So the rods take care of intensity, but also are our primary vision tool at night. Anybody's ever done night maneuvers or, had to work at night, you realize there's this whole phenomenon called night blindness, where if you stare at an object directly in front of you straight on, after a while, kind of looks like it disappears. And that's just because the cones are not, or the rods are not in the center of the eye. They are around the cones, which means that if you look off to the side just a little bit, peripheral vision, you will be able to see the object fine. Now, our cones, we have three main receptacles in there for our cones. We've got red, we've got green, and we've got blue, and they each respond to their own wavelength of light or energy. So we've got rods, we've got three cones. They pretty much make up the sensors that send our brain signals, and our brain tries to make sense out of it. Now, in theory, we really don't see color. We just see different wavelengths, and that then translates to our brain as color information. But it's all about the size of the wave or the type of wave that it is. But having color kind of makes our world really interesting. It would be this kind of, oh, it's all gray. Hey, look at, there's gray there and gray there. So having red, green, and blue cones in our eyes works really well, obviously, because all of our devices that we've modeled after displaying what we see are based on that RGB model. Red, green, blue. We've got little tiny LEDs, LCDs, little cathode ray guns in the old school TVs and monitors that we used to have. But they're still the same information. They're basically making those three colors, mixing them together and giving us visibility. Now, when we mix color with light, we are using basically what is called the additive method. Unlike fine art, which is usually subtractive. Think of sculpting, right? Start off with a big chunk of clay, you take away what you don't want. Think about color on canvas. We start off with a canvas that's usually a light color. And then when we mix colors, we get different colors. And if you mix all the colors together, you kind of get a yucky, dull brown. On the other hand, when we work with light, we start off with white. When all color is present, when all light is present equally. Now, got a little quick animation here. Got an animated spotlight, a red one, a green one, and a blue one. Basically, they go on, and you can see what happens when they mix together. So for example, well, let me finish that. All right, so you get red and you get green. Where they overlap, what color do you get? Yellow. So now we've got green and we've got blue. Where they overlap, we get cyan. And of course, blue and red, you mix them together, you get magenta. So we've got our primary colors for us, which is RGB. We've got our secondary colors, which are yellow, cyan, and magenta. We start off with black, and we add all these colors together. And at the end, when they all overlap equally, in the middle, what do we have? Yeah, we have white. Now, mixing color is additive, but also the intensities are additive, which means that, for example, I'm going to give an arbitrary number to the spotlights here. So let's pick a color I don't have. Come on, give me that. Give me, come on. Wow, all right. So let's pick an arbitrary color. We'll say I got 4 for red, 4 for green, and 4 for blue. That's just an arbitrary intensity number. So in theory, when all of those colors overlap together, we get white. When all the intensities overlap together, we get the sum total of all 3 lights. So if we were to measure each light would have an intensity of 4. What would we have here in the middle? What would our intensity be here? Well, it's a sum, which means you take 4 plus 4 plus 4. 12. Yeah. It's not really a trick. I just got it down there. So this is not really important with a single light, but it is really important when you start using multiple lights, which you guys will find out on Friday when we start using multiple lights, because each light individually may look a little off, but the final product is really what we're after. And that's what we see all the time when we're looking at, finished photograph or any kind of artwork, movie, game, TV show, YouTube channel. That light added together from all those different sources gives us that final version. So light, color, and intensity are additive. All right, does that make sense? Questions? Any questions out there in Zoom? Jerry's good. Katie's good. Okay. Josh, Deja, Haley, good. Maddie. All right. Thank you. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about why we see color when we look at an object. So here we've got a reddish sphere. Why is it that we see red? If we're told that most of our light, when it's white, it contains all colors, what happens to the other colors? Where are they? Anybody? All colors are gone. Where are they? Okay. They're still all there. Okay. So you're right about that. Energy just doesn't die. It gets, transformed in some manner. So Nelson said all the colors are gone except red, or they're not visible. You're all the things I heard are actually correct. What happens is when we have a red object, most of the other light rays are absorbed, meaning they are taken in by the material and generally not released. Now, if you take enough energy in, obviously things heat up. Because you start to store energy, it generates heat from all the moving molecules. So the other colors are kind of trapped in there and absorbed and not released. Now, they could be trapped on the surface and just kind of not bouncing back, which is really what happens when we talk about light. Light hits a surface, bounces off that surface into our eyes, into the camera. That's what gives us visibility. So we've got a red sphere. Red is the primary color that is reflected back to us. Now, there might be a little bit of blue, there might be a little bit of green to kind of deepen that red, but that would be the primary colors. Good, you're absolutely right. So this kind of leads us to, there are really three basic properties that light hitting a surface can exhibit. One is they can be absorbed. If all the wavelengths of light are absorbed, we kind of get this Vantablack black hole. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Vantablack. It's like, I don't know, $4,000 a quart to paint something. It's really expensive. There's a couple of museums around the world that actually have a display where they paint a circle on the middle of the floor, and people just go there and, they have to rope it off because people will just get all disoriented and fall. They think they're falling into the hole, but they just fall on the ground. Actually hilarious, but can be dangerous. Anyway, so objects can absorb light. Objects can also reflect light. Now, if an object reflects all the light, and it's a very, very smooth object, we basically get a mirror, or we get something that reflects the environment back unaltered. We see a lot of detail. That means a smooth, hard surface that is reflecting probably all of the light. And a surface can also transmit light. If it transmits light and doesn't alter its path, that is called transmission. When light passes through a medium, a surface, and its path is altered, that's called refraction. So you say, well, how does that work? Well, air is considered a gas. We kind of swim around in it all day. That's how we get oxygen. That's what helps our bodies function properly. Light rays pass through it pretty much unobstructed all the time. Unless, of course, you're in Florida and it's really hot outside and humid. And then you can usually see in the parking lot like little wavy lines of, you can see distortion from all the heat that has kind of gathered and stirred up all the moisture, and it kind of makes it move around. That would be refraction. But for the most part, air is pretty clear, pretty clean, and allows light to transmit through. You have something like our bottles here. In order to see through it, the light is going to get bent because the bottle is clear, but not perfectly clear and not perfectly smooth. It's got some imperfections in it. So light will refract or bend as it passes through. So absorption, reflectance, transmission, and refraction. Now we get into objects that can reflect light, whether they are smooth or not. And we'll get into this a lot more when we start working with materials in Lecture 6. But for now, everything that we are using on our objects to render, and that includes project 1 all the way up through project 5. We are using what is called a diffuse material. Now, some of you might say, oh, that's Lambert. But Lambert is not the technical name. Lambert is the computer scientist who wrote the code to describe the Lambertian diffusion effect. Diffusion occurs when you have microscopic irregularities on a surface that may look smooth, but it's not really perfectly smooth. And those microscopic reflections will take light rays in, and most light rays come in an organized pattern. They come in and they hit that surface, all the little nooks and crannies, and then they are diffused going in all different directions. Consequently, the surface doesn't have any visible environment in it or visible highlights from direct light sources, like we're used to seeing. So visible reflections would be here. You'd be able to see environment. You'd be able to see direct light highlights. Diffuse surfaces have none of that. Light bounces, reflects in multiple directions. It's not absorbed, it is reflected, but scattered. Now, just as an interesting exercise, can anybody name something in your environment that you think would be make a case for diffuse? And one way to figure out if a surface is diffuse or not is to look at it from all different angles. So for example, I'm going to use our walls here at Full Sail. Okay, our walls, you look at them, and if you look at them straight on, they really don't look that shiny or like they're reflective. But if you get at any other viewing angle other than straight on, you start to look off to the side, you can see there's a little bit of shine, very, very soft bit of reflectivity in the walls, because the paint is what they call semi-gloss. It's meant to be easy to clean, but also not to be too dull, because basically, every little bit of light you have in here, you want bouncing around. But if you go up, put your face, well, I don't advise putting your face that close to the wall, but if you look at it from the side, you can see that there's a little bit of shine, a little bit of reflectivity. You can see some of the lights from the ceiling reflecting on the wall. You might even be able to see some really, really vague environment reflections if you're at a steep enough angle, like almost 90 degrees. like just look at it from the side. Compare that with the carpet. Now, the carpet has all kinds of little fibers that stick up. All those little fibers tend to diffuse the light. So carpet, a lot of fabrics, cotton, for example, wool, a lot of natural fibers will be very diffuse when they're put together. The exception might be silk. Silk is super, super fine thread. When woven together very tightly, it can be almost a little shiny. But for the most part, all of our natural fibers that we make most of our stuff out of, the jeans, t-shirts, sweatshirts, caps, hoodies, most of that is diffuse because of all those microscopic fibers. I mean, I can look at my hoodie and I can see all the little fibers sticking up right on the side of it. So, as I mentioned, diffuse surfaces have no environment reflections and no direct light highlights. You can't tell where the light source, you can't actually see the highlight of the light source in its reflection. Primary visibility is a result of a diffuse reflection. A lot of times in gaming, it's called your base in your material. It's the base color, the base part of the material. Everything sits on top of that. That gives you primary visibility and color, but no reflectivity, no transparency, none of the other things that we associate material properties with. Now, like I said, the reason we talk about this is because all of our objects, when we light, are going to be flat, diffuse objects. If you can make your lighting look good, flat and diffuse, when we go to add materials and we go to add textures, it'll come to life. Now, the thing is, if we light with pure diffuse and we add shiny stuff and we add textures and patterns, we may still need to go back and tweak the lighting based on what we've changed. But for the most part, it will give you a good 85–90% chance that your lighting looks pretty good. Does that make sense? All right. So pretty much any modern renderer, and I forgot to include Unreal and Unity in here, but they all have a base part of the material. Arnold calls it base color. RenderMan just calls it diffuse color. V-Ray calls it, under basic parameters, diffuse color. That is really what that diffuse part of the material is. That is the technical name for it. Diffused reflection. Important today because today you guys are going to be assigning the base Arnold material to all of your objects in your scenes. That's going to be your responsibility from now on. So first, project was just about rendering. Didn't have to worry about putting materials on it. You didn't have to worry about lighting. Today, you have to worry about materials and worry about lighting. But the material part is pretty simple. You put it on, set the parameters properly, and you've got a diffuse material. Now, the thing with Arnold is, when you assign a base Arnold material to something, it's very shiny. So you have to turn off the specular weight. It's got to go to 0. And also, for some reason, Arnold has the color not at 50% gray like most, base starts. Base starts are usually 50% gray because it's right in the middle, it's neutral. Arnold leans more towards white. So we're going to be adjusting the base color to make the value 50% gray, which is 0.5 value. And we're going to be turning the specular weight off. And I'll go over that again. It's also in the instructions. So that's the only thing you have to do. You assign one material to every object, just like Maya's, you make anything in Maya, you get a Lambert. And that Lambert has kind of universal properties. So that's sort of what we're going to be doing with our stuff. Only you're going to be in control to make sure everything's there. Might sound scary, but it's actually very, very simple to do. Let's get into lighting now, actually. So when we talk about lighting on a diffuse surface, got a couple diffuse surfaces here. We talk and we use different terminology. A lot of times you might hear the terminology like hard light, soft light. And a lot of times that's pretty ambiguous, especially if you don't have a photography background or lighting background somewhere. It's really nothing more than a figure of speech. Really what we mean is if you've got a hard light, we mean a small light, usually far away. Now, your light can still be big, but if it's far away enough, it will still function like a small light. Soft light is usually a big light or a light close to the light or close to the subject. Or, sorry, not subject, close to the light source. Now, as I kind of mentioned the other day on Monday in lecture 1, where I stood, I'm going to get up and stand in front of the projector again. Stand in front of the projector by standing far enough back, put my hand up, my shadow from my hand is very detailed. See nice sharp edges to my shadow? That indicates that the light is either really small or pretty far away. In this case, it's both, because that projector light is actually pretty small and it's about 20 feet away. But as my hand starts to get closer to the light, the size of the light's not changing, but the position of my hand is. It's getting closer and closer to that light source. The shadow of my hand becomes softer and softer. That's because the apparent size of the light to my hand is changing. That would indicate a softer light. And when you have a big, soft light source in front of an object, you get very soft shadows. Think when you go outside on an overcast day. No direct sunlight, a lot of clouds overhead, but it's not completely dark. You walk outside and you look at the ground, it's really hard to see your shadow down there. But it's there. It's just the light is so diffused because the sun, all of the skylight is passing through a moisture layer of clouds. And all those little tiny particles of moisture are diffusing the light. So the light just kind of comes down from all directions, wrapping around you, and it makes really soft shadows. All right, I'm back. Just sticking my hand in front of the projector again. So remember, hard light, soft light really has nothing at all to do with light intensity. So I got a little animation here to kind of make this point. And what I was doing basically in front of the projector was I was standing really close to the screen. So I had a really razor sharp shadow on my hand, just like when this sphere sits on the ground plane. When the sphere gets up and moves closer to the light, the shadow gets larger and it also gets softer. It starts to expand. it starts to get really fuzzy on the edges. That's because the size of the light, while not physically changing, the object being closer to it makes the apparent light bigger, creating a softer shadow. All right, does that make sense? Anybody have any questions? Jerry's good, Deja's good. Katie, anybody here? Campus, questions? No? Okay. All right, so let's talk about some of our light sources that we have in the real world and talk about the properties of them, because we're going to be mimicking those lights in CG. So let's start with the most obvious. Humanity's key light, the sun. So the sun is 1 million times larger than Earth, but fortunately it is 90 million miles away. So if the Earth were put side by side with the sun, we would be a flaming ball and we would all be in incorporeal form somewhere, you know, vapor, plasma vapor somewhere, just having class. But like I said, fortunately, the sun being 90 million miles away is relatively small in the sky to us. It's roughly about 5 centimeters. Now, the sun emits light in which direction? Yeah, all around. Technically, it's called an omnidirectional light source. Ooh, let's get some color in there. (360 degrees) shoots light all around. Of those 360 degrees, how many do you think we actually get here on Earth? All right, so 180 would be this. But if we draw lines out from the sun to the Earth, you can see we're not even getting, what's that? 30? Yeah, that would be probably pretty good, honestly, because of how far away the sun is. If you try to calculate the actual angle, you have to be really pretty close to the sun to do that. It's probably more like under 5%, 5 degrees. It's between, I think it's between 5 and 10, somewhere around there. Now, what that means for us on Earth is, by the time those light rays from the sun reach Earth, they are considered parallel light rays. So parallel light rays cause parallel shadows. Go outside, take a look. Trees, telephone poles, light posts, fence posts, all their shadows are pretty much perfectly parallel, facing the same direction. That's because of those parallel light rays. Parallel light rays create parallel shadows. A light that does not have parallel shadow or parallel light rays will kind of fan out like a projector. In our projector, if we were to shine, if I take my cell phone and put a couple of objects here, and shine my light on them, which I don't know if you guys can see this without me unplugging myself in Zoom, but the shadows kind of fan out. So the object in the middle kind of goes that way. The other objects kind of point in that direction. So parallel light rays, parallel shadows, that gives us our built-in sun that's considered really a hard light. Go outside at noon, shadows are directly under your feet. Shadow edges are pretty hard. You go out in, kind of later morning, early afternoon, between like 10 and noon, or between like 2 and 4, you've got shadows that are not directly underneath, but they are still considered pretty hard. Now, not all of the light from the sun reaches Earth directly. Not all the light from the sun reaches Earth. Not all of the light that reaches Earth is directly from the sun. Some of it is dissipated, diffused in our atmosphere. In addition to clouds, we've also got like 5 layers of atmosphere that light needs to go through. All different kinds of layers and different makeups of gas in them. And each one kind of diffuses a little bit of that sunlight. That's why when it finally gets through on a clear, bright day, we've got a nice blue sky. That's basically a result of all the different gases that the sunlight has to go through that surround our planet. The light that hits the clouds, which we talked a little bit about, gets diffused, gets spread out. So the sun actually comes to us as a direct light. All the direct light making it to Earth comes through the atmosphere as kind of a diffused, really nice sky color. And then any remaining light will get diffused in any clouds that are in the atmosphere. So they create a large diffused area of light. So we kind of get a fill light and a key light all in one shot with the sun. Diffused light. Don't forget that in addition to light diffusing through the atmosphere, when light hits the ground or hits any object, it bounces off. When light bounces off of an object, it will diffuse even more, because not all objects are very smooth. So each time light hits a surface, it diffuses, hits another surface, diffuses more. That's why when you're rendering, all that diffused indirect light is really hard to clean up, because it's scattered in so many directions. So soft light is diffused light. Hard light is basically pretty direct light. It's not diffused. All right, does that kind of make sense? Questions? Anybody in Zoom? Questions? Jerry's good. Katie's good. Nelson, Deja, Maddie. Brian's good. Thank you. Quick drink. All right, so lighting. in addition to helping to illuminate your scene, it can also be used as a compositional tool to help direct the viewer's eye where you want them to look. That's the beauty of a still image. The audience has time to look where you want them to see first, but then they can kind of wander around your composition, which is why, use the rule of thirds, the golden mean, to help guide the eye around so the audience or your viewer can see what you want them to see. Usually they're going to go to the brightest area, maybe area that's shiny or got color in it first, and then start moving around from there. So, principles of light, which we talked about a little bit earlier. This is the basis for all good lighting. Light direction. Where is the light coming from? Light intensity. How bright is the light? Light color. Is there any color? If it looks white, then it might be white. If it looks like it's got a little bit of warmth in it, it's probably going to have maybe some yellows and oranges, maybe a little red. If it's cool, it might have some greens or some blues in it. Purples are kind of an interesting color because it's got reds and it's got, blues in it all at the same time. So it could kind of go in either direction depending on how it's used. And then there's shadow quality. Are the shadows hard? Are they soft? So lighting helps us define the world we see, the artwork we want our viewer to see, helps us understand shape and form, spatial relationships. How far is one object from another? You got overlap, you don't have overlap. So we've got different types of light that we've named. We've got key lights and fill lights and bounce lights, rim lights, backlights, up lights, or sometimes called kick lights, down lights. They're basically all used for varying purposes, but they all help us to provide the viewer with insight into our art or our scene or what we want them to see. We kind of shape how we want the audience to view our stuff. So key lights, their job is to provide the main shadow source. So if you can figure out where is the main shadow. Now, if you take a look in our environment here, you take your hand, put it on the ground. You probably have a couple of really faint shadows all around your hand. That's because there's multiple light sources hitting your hand from all different directions. But one of them should be dominant somewhere, and that would be your key light. Especially if you're trying to make art. You just don't want to make ambiguous things. You really kind of have to push it as an artist to go, okay, we're establishing a light direction. So key light, main shadow source, usually, I'd say 99% of the time, 180 degrees from the light source. It's very rare if it's ever changed or it's altered in some way, because it's really jarring, because that's not the way that light works in the real world. But totally possible for something super stylized. You can pretty much do anything you want, but you got to know the rules to break them. So a fill light's job is to support the key light. It's never as bright as the key. The key light is the dominant light. So here in this example, we got key light on the right. Key light doesn't provide enough light on the opposite side, so a fill light is added. The fill light's job is to basically fill in any areas that the key light can't get to, so you don't have total darkness. Now, when you're first starting out, a lot of people say, well, I got a key light, but how do I know how bright to make the fill light? Right? So a good starting point for a fill light make it 50% of the intensity of the key. This way, you've established a relationship. You've got a dominant light and you've got a light with half the power. That automatically makes one light key and one light fill. Now, if the fill light's too bright, turn it down. If it's too dark, turn it up. But it's a starting point. It's not to be carved in stone on a mountaintop anywhere. We're not going to land on the moon and find, fill light should always be 50% embedded in some moon crater. That's just not going to happen. So it's just a good starting point. Now, when you're working with lighting, a lot of times you may want something to look unstaged, natural, something kind of off the cuff, improvised, like you would take it if things weren't set up. And that's when we start to use things like bounce light as a key provider. You can still have bounce light, which is usually very soft. You can see it's very diffused. You can still have it be dominant from a direction. But the fact that you make it soft gives the audience a sense of intimacy with what's going on in your scene. If you're doing an interview, a lot of times you may have a lot of bounce lights because you want the audience to feel like you're being let in on a secret or something that is information that is, being relayed from the interviewee to the audience. So bounce light, you take light source, shine it onto a reflective surface, aim that reflective surface at your subject. Light hits that reflective surface, diffuses, comes off of there, goes to the subject. This works really, really good for real-world lighting. But in CG, we do not get a one-to-one energy transfer. If we bounce light off of an object, we don't get as much energy as we do in the real world. So instead of using a bounce card or a reflective surface, we use another light, but we use a light that's already made to be diffused. So it acts like a bounce card or a diffuser. And that light primarily is an area light. An area light is designed to be a giant surface that emits light in all directions. So difference would be, if you were to stand up like I did, put your hand in front of the projector, you'd see that hard shadow. That would be direct light coming from the projector. If you were to turn around and look at the light bouncing off of the screen onto you or onto your surface or your subject, that screen, if I turn the projector off, it's got little tiny pieces of silver all embedded in the screen. And that diffuses the light so it's not so harsh. So we can look at a screen, be able to see what's on there without having the light bounce directly into our eyes. Now, that diffused light acts like a big giant area light, big giant broad surface of light that's diffused. Okay, rim light. Rim light Sometimes people get rim light confused with backlight. So they might say, oh, 3-point lighting, we got key, fill, and back. But a lot of times they may mean key, fill, and rim, because a backlight, like the name implies, is directly behind the subject. And a lot of times backlight will create a silhouette like that. But let's go back to rim for a second. So rim light is usually used to help separate the subject from the backdrop or from the background. That's what its main job is. If we don't have a rim light, in a lot of instances, we have foreground bleeding into the background, we lose a sense of depth. Perfect example, Gary Sinise here on the right. Typical headshot. Got a key light coming in from the right side. It's up a little high, so it's probably right about here. You can tell there's a lot of different cues. You can see where the highlight is in the eye. It's above the horizon line or center line of the eye. It's usually a little bit up. You can see we got a highlight here, so it's kind of more or less in front, coming down. Subject has a dark shirt on. Photographers love their gradient backgrounds because it makes for an interesting background. So usually what they'll do is they will, kind of angle the background so the area closest to the light is lighter, and as it gets further away from the light, it gets darker. Problem with that is you got a really dark background in the lower left. You've got a subject with a really dark shirt on. Unless you put something there to separate them, shirt blends into background and you lose a sense of depth. So we got key light here. We got a little bit of fill light going on here. Could be fill, could be a bounce card, could be anything, but we got some kind of fill. But now the subject shirt blends into the background. So what do? We put a small bright light behind the subject, aim it at their side that is blending into the background. It's usually opposite from the key light. And we try to create an edge or a rim that helps to separate the subject from the backdrop. It's like a little slice of light in there that really makes the subject come forward. You'll notice it pretty much any crime drama on TV. Wherever they're doing an interview or they're looking at something really intently, like, wow, this is so intense and so interesting and so important to the story, they usually put a rim light on them. Especially if you've got hair happening in there, hair lights up, really makes everything look kind of interesting. So usually a hard light behind the subject to one side helps separate subject from backdrop. Now, we get into using a backlight. The backlight is usually aimed at the subject. The subject is in front of the light, and then the camera sees the subject. So it's usually camera, subject, light behind subject, throws the subject usually into silhouette because the background is brighter than the subject. Very effective as a storytelling device. So this movie, I think this is 1946. It's called The Big Combo. The one on the right is 2001. It's The Man Who Wasn't There, Coen Brothers film. If anybody's a cinema fan, they're usually really pretty good with lighting and storytelling. So this is done in the style of what's called film noir. Film noir, black film, dark film, very kind of, it's what all of our modern crime dramas were based off of. And film noir usually has a very specific format. It usually starts off with the main character narrating it, and traditionally mostly done in black and white because it's very, very effective in creating that dark mood that most film or crime drama has. So with proper staging, this kind of lighting is as good as any narration or any, dialogue that would be there. And if you set the staging right, the audience can read it and know exactly what's going to happen or is about to happen in the case of the right. Anytime you see a silhouette of a character in the foreground and somebody in the shower or in a bathtub or lounging somewhere, that is always a foreshadowing of, guess what, doesn't go well for the person in the tub in the next scene, which is, I'm not going to spoil the movie, but that is the case in this shot. So here on the left, you've got a very effective shot. Instead of just having a light background, they've decided to put some smoke, some steam, some fog between the light and the subject, so it really kind of lights up. Really, that cloudy, billowy look makes for a very interesting visual. And of course, you've got everything staged properly. Everything's separated. Everything is, designed to impact the story and the audience. Now, uplight, floor light, kick light, these are basically lights that usually come from below. They can come from above, but traditionally from below. So uplight was really one of the key early horror film lighting styles that was used, talking about way back in the 1920s, somewhere around there, where it's very jarring to an audience. If you've never seen that kind of light before, most of the light we have in the real world comes from above. You go outside, you got the sun up. You go outside, the moon is usually above. Most of our lighting comes from above because it makes it easy to see. When you put light from below, well, that's really jarring. And a lot of times the audience used to associate it with, any light coming from below was hellfire, came from El Diablo, down deep. And of course, that's, you go to a campfire, you tell scary stories, you scare the crap out of your siblings, you put a flashlight under your face, and everything looks really creepy. A kick light, though, would be to accent a specific area of your subject that the key light, the fill light, any other light doesn't necessarily illuminate. And it's just there for visual interest or as a way to guide the audience on what is or might be important in a coming shot. So usually accent, like I have up there, accent features that you want the audience to make sure they don't miss. Now, downlight used all the time in most of our lighting, right? You got stage lighting, you've got our nighttime lighting, interior, exterior, but really an effective tool when used in cinema. So here in the middle, The Godfather, Francis Ford Coppola, they stuck a super bright spotlight above Marlon Brando's head. You can see it, that bright spotlight burning a hole pretty much on his forehead, but they got the effect of having the eyebrows overshadow the eyes, so it looks very soulless. And that was intentionally done that way so that anytime the Godfather was in his library doing business, that was the lighting they had. They always put a light above him, stuck him in the chair, and he was always, making his proclamations. Now, let's we talked about some of the basic light types, light directions. Let's talk a little bit about early CG, because it's really important to know where we came from and compare it to where we're at right now. So let's just put some things in perspective here. What was the year that the first Toy Story movie was released? Okay, somebody got it right first time, 1995. So let's equate that to, anybody knows anything about computers or knows anything about little historical computer perspective? There's like Windows 95. Windows 95, when Windows crawled out of the DOS primordial ooze. Okay, before then you had DOS, well, command line. You had to actually, early versions of Windows, you had to actually execute the win command in order to get some kind of graphical interface, but it wasn't a standalone. Computer power was measured in hertz, not megahertz or gigahertz yet, hertz. And eventually went on to megahertz. Storage was in bytes, kilobytes, and eventually megabytes. But very, very, very primal processing power. Cell phones. Man, none of you were alive at that time. But, oh, you were, okay. But you were probably very young.
I was 2 years old.
Okay, 2 years old. So you probably don't have much of a recollection of what cell phones were.
No.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. You're not missing anything. We all walked around on, scraping our knuckles on the ground and lived in caves and, it was awful. Anyway, computers, cell phones, primitive. Cell phones about the size of a brick, honestly. A lot of radiation, had a life of maybe an hour if you were lucky before it had to be recharged. Most of the time they were supposed to be portable, but you really needed them plugged into a power source almost all the time. Sure, you go out in the car and use it, but by the time you got back, it was drained. With all that said, Maya wasn't even Maya was Maya at that time. Maya came from another program called Power Animator, which was Unix only, was designed by a company called Silicon Graphics. And it was minimal as far as a graphical interface. It was pretty good. I mean, at the time it was state of the art, which was amazing. Today it would be really laughable. Like everybody's cell phone is a lot more powerful than the best computer back then. But Pixar, they were artists as well as technicians. And they realized that in order for an audience to relate to a story, you needed to have lighting, characters, and story that were relatable to an audience. And they knew with all the limitations they had, and Pixar, when they first started out, only had a few computers. And in order to render their frames, they would beg, borrow, and steal any processing power from any other company that would let them use it. At that time, 1995 or 1990, we'll say, because that's when they started working on this. 1990, most offices, hey, we're done at 5, flip off the lights, you go home. Well, Pixar said, hey, instead of flipping off the lights, why don't you leave your computers on? Let us rent your computing power. And we can render stuff out while you're sleeping. Distributive rendering basically is what they did. Which was easy in those days because pretty much everything talked to everything else in a Unix format. And it was pretty easy to be able to go, hey, you know, that computer over there, anybody using it? No, according to the network, nope, it's idle. Good, boop, that's another node in our renderer. That was in the days before there was lots of hacking and network piracy and data theft. That was in our blind innocence. But Pixar realized they needed to have characters lit that were relatable. And they used the pretty much standard techniques of key light, fill light, rim light. And these are lighting breakdowns. This is what each light does by itself. And at the very end, when all lights are present, that is the final result. So lighting is additive. The key light plus the fill light plus the rim light equals the final look for Woody. Sometimes we don't appreciate what had to be done because they made it look seamless and pretty natural. And Toy Story is starting to look a little dated, but it still holds up pretty well. I mean, the story's good, the animation is still really good. Some of the textures, some of the lighting, the rendering, we can definitely tell to our eyes it is a little dated looking. Doesn't have that depth and the crispness and the realism that modern textures and modern rendering engines have. Because there was no global illumination then. Everything was lit by some light or another. And you'll notice this fill light looks like it comes from everywhere. And that was basically one of Maya's most evil and foulest of lights, called an ambient light, which basically was a big sphere that just shined light inside your subject in all directions. And all you could control was the intensity. It made everything look flat. And unless you knew how to use it, it just flattened everything. Everything looked terrible. But they figured out a way to use it decently so it worked with the story. All right, so a lot of hurdles they had to overcome. Let's go fast forward a couple of years. What year did Bug's Life come out? Okay, 1998. So we got Windows 98. Hey, it doesn't crash as much as Windows 95. The computers are a little more powerful. We're in megahertz. We might be heading towards gigahertz towards the end of, closer to 2000. We're getting there. Memory's definitely gotten better. We're definitely in the megabyte stage, heading towards gig. Terabyte unheard of at the time. That was like a theoretical amount of memory you could store. But notice that Pixar has a whole lot more lights and very subtle usage of lights than they had 3 years earlier. So we've got a key light, we've got a fill light, we got a rim left, kind of hard to see, but there's light over here. We got rim right over here. We got a little bit of kick light right here with the face, and we got some bounce light underneath. So under the chin, under the various parts of Flick, it's not super dark, meant to look natural. So again, all of these lights individually look strange, but in the end, you get all lights together. And this is when Flick's kicked out of the ant colony and is basically with the circus bugs heading who knows where. Also, 1998, there were a whole bunch of other firsts that Pixar was able to do, which a lot of people don't realize and kind of we just take for granted. You can tell there's a whole lot more lights. The opening shot, that shot of all the flowers and everything, that was a lot of color. That was a lot of objects to render at a time. Compare that with like Toy Story, where you got a lawn, maybe a couple houses go by that they render out and they just zoom them by. this was a really big deal because this was one of the first movies that had over 100 characters with their own animation moving at one time in a scene. This is where Hopper comes down into the ant colony and he's terrorizing them. He's coming down there and he looks down a tunnel and there's like 100 little flick characters and they're all kind of doing this, not knowing what to do. That was a big deal. That was a monumental rendering feat at the time. That was like equivalent to like a 20-hour render for that shot. Also, there's another shot. Of course, this involves Hopper also. This is where the ants kind of get together with the circus bug and they try to make this bird, flaming bird, scare Hopper and all his friends away, right? But Hopper finds out, the bird crashes, the bird's smoldering in a pile here, and Hopper's kicking the crap out of Flick. But behind him, there's flames, there's sparks, there's smoke. That was all early visual effects. That was all CG visual effects, which was a big deal at the time again. So all of these things, just incrementally, everything that we have done since Toy Story has pushed animation further. And not just Pixar, like other companies come in and everybody pushes everybody else. So now we're to the point of being able to make pretty much a full-length feature film in real time, in Unreal, with ray tracing and all of that stuff. We're not quite to the point of being able to put all the visual effects in there at the same time, because that's a lot to do. But we're really close. And now we can go make stories in a, virtual, volume environment and be able to have real actors lit with our CG scenes. Again, a huge feat. Now we're starting to mix the mediums together pretty much seamlessly, all for the basis of storytelling. Whether we realize it or not, every piece of art you do, you're basically telling a story in some way. So lighting is always going to play a big part of that. In the real world, we have no choice. To make something visible, you got to have a camera, you got to have an object, and you got to have light in there too. All right, that kind of makes sense. So, lighting is really one of those things that is foundational that a lot of times is just overlooked. But it can really make or break something you're working on and separate it from the realm of amateur to make it professional. All right, now, talked a little bit about film noir. The reason I mentioned film noir is because in today's exercise, you guys are going to do 5 different exercises. We're going to be working with what are called the basic light positions. Which is usually something called front light, where the light is coming pretty much same direction that the camera is aimed at. You've got top light, usually light that is above the subject in some way, aimed down. You've got side light. Side light could be on the right, could be on the left, but it's light coming in from the side. If anybody's ever seen any ballet lighting, they usually light ballet from the sides because it really helps to show the human form. Light them from both sides, you have all the ballet dancers wearing really tight outfits, but it shows off the musculature of the body and really helps everything kind of flow when you look at it on stage. And then we have backlight, where the light is behind the subject. You could take the same subject change the lighting, and it changes the mood of your subject. Add into that, this is basic light direction, add into that intensity and color, and you've got the makings for an artistic formula where you can set the mood almost immediately. So you're going to do 5 exercises. You're going to do 1 from the top, 1 from the front, 1 from the side, 1 from the back. And then you'll get a chance to do a My Light where you will go find reference on the internet. And the reason I like to mention film noir is because that is usually meant to look like it is done with a single light source. And it provides a lot of good inspiration for people who are looking for a simple single light source that really has a lot of impact. So again, we talked a little bit about this. This kind of got its start in the 1930s, 1940s. One of the people who is sometimes considered to be the father of film noir is John Alton. He was a cinematographer who pretty much came up with the lighting style for film noir. He worked on a lot of the big films that people reference all the time. He wrote a book called Painting with Light, where he describes this whole philosophy of, how does lighting in film noir different from traditional cinematography lighting? And, what is the reason behind it? So the whole idea was a lighting style that could be as effective as good directing, good acting, good storytelling, and used as a part to enhance it all. And again, often meant to look like it is achieved with a single or limited light source. And film noir has this kind of recipe of what they call pools of light, where you've got areas of dark and areas of light, and they're all over, but they all help to define the subject. So for example, here in this image, we've got dark, we've got light, we've got dark, we've got light there, we've got dark here, we've got light, we've got dark, right? It's all kind of layered in there very carefully, so it looks very simple, but it helps the audience be able to read everything. This is also a time when they were experimenting with, we don't have to show the entire face. You get a good actor, they can pretty much emote the scene just by having the camera see the eyes. The eyes telling the story of what's going on or what the character is thinking of. Also, film noir really big with really interesting shadow patterns. Shadow was used as a compositional tool. Shadows weren't seen as a way of getting in, or wasn't seen as getting in the way of the subject. It was actually there to enhance the subject. So you have all these, different shadow patterns. They pass light through blinds. That makes for a really interesting shot. Pass light through a grid, pass light through the bars of a cell, or just pretty much any different kind of pattern, just to make the shadows very interesting and also to help define the story. So again, often seen as a single light source. So we'll talk a little bit about that some more after we get back from break. This is probably a pretty good time to take a break. Before we go on break, anybody have any questions? Everybody good so far? Okay, how about out there in the Zoomosphere? Any questions? Okay, Katie's good. Deja's good. Brian's good. Josh, Maddie, Maxwell. All right. Thank you. All right, so what we'll do is we'll take a short break, just like on Monday. I have to end the Zoom session so I can render out the first part of the lecture, upload it to YouTube. and should be able to do that in 20 minutes. All right, so let's see, it is 2:50. So let's come back at 3:12. Give me a chance to render everything out. Should be 20 minutes. Yeah. All right. So I'll see you then.